The gym of Iron Pride Gym was not the kind of place you joined to post pictures on social media or to brag about your fitness journey with fancy equipment. It was a raw, sweat-stained hall of discipline where echoes of punches bounced off the old brick walls and where fighters learned quickly that pride could be broken as easily as a nose. The air always seemed to carry a thick mixture of sweat, leather, and disinfectant, as if the struggles of yesterday's sparring matches never truly left. Heavy bags lined one side of the room, their surfaces worn thin from countless hours of fists pounding against them. On the far side, a modest cage stood as the centerpiece, its metal bars cold and intimidating, the kind of place where men and women tested not only their skills but also their limits. This was the heart of the gym, and in the heart of that cage stood a man who thought of himself as king. Victor Merrick, the trainer who ran Iron Pride with the voice of a drill sergeant and the ego of a champion who never quite made it to the top. Victor was built like a stone pillar, square shoulders stacked above a wide chest, his shaved head shining under the buzzing fluorescent lights. His voice carried across the hall in sharp commands that allowed no room for hesitation. He didn't ask. He demanded. He didn't suggest. He barked. The fighters under him, some young and eager, some hardened and weary, learned quickly that to survive under his instruction meant to keep your mouth shut, push past exhaustion, and absorb both his lessons and his insults without protest. Some admired him, believing his harsh style shaped stronger fighters. Others feared him, knowing that he thrived on breaking egos and reminding everyone who really controlled the gym. But whether they admired or feared him, all of them respected the authority he carried. On that particular afternoon, the Arizona sun baked the city outside, but inside the gym the heat was no less suffocating. Fans whirred uselessly against the heavy air as the sound of skipping ropes, clanging weights, and grunts of effort filled the space. Fighters circled the mat, some shadowboxing, others resting on the worn benches with towels wrapped around their necks. It was just another day inside Iron Pride, yet tension always seemed to brew whenever Victor prowled the floor like a predator. His mood could shift the atmosphere, and everyone knew it. When he was in good spirits, the gym thrived with energy. When he was in foul spirits, silence and nervousness swept across the fighters like a storm cloud. Today he was restless, his patience thin, and his eyes searching for someone to remind of his dominance. That was when his gaze landed on the janitor. Darnell Hughes moved quietly through the gym, pushing his mop bucket along the sidewall, collecting discarded water bottles and wiping down sweat-stained mirrors. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't loud, and most of the fighters hardly even noticed him. To them, he was part of the background, the man who kept the place clean while they trained to make names for themselves. Tall and lean with a quiet, unbothered expression, Darnell blended into the shadows, working steadily without complaint. He never interrupted, never tried to insert himself into the culture of the fighters, and never spoke unless spoken to. In his silence, some saw humility, but in Victor's eyes, that silence looked too much like weakness. Victor leaned on the ropes of the cage, watching Darnell for a long moment, and then a smirk crept across his face. He raised his voice, cutting through the noise of the gym like a whip crack. "Hey, Hughes!" The sound froze the room. Fighters lowered their gloves, weights stopped clanging, conversations faded into silence. All eyes shifted toward the janitor, who now stood with a trash bag in his hand, looking uncertainly in Victor's direction. Darnell had grown used to being ignored, and for the first time in weeks, every head in the room had turned his way. He blinked once, slowly, and straightened, his calm eyes meeting Victor's across the room. Victor grinned, spreading his arms wide as if he was a showman entertaining a crowd. "Tell me something, Hughes. You ever even try a push-up? Or you just come here to clean up after the real athletes?" A ripple of nervous laughter ran through the gym. Some chuckled out of loyalty to Victor, others out of the uncomfortable pressure of the moment. Darnell didn't laugh. He didn't even smirk. His face stayed calm, the same calmness he wore when sweeping floors or carrying a mop bucket. He tied the trash bag with deliberate care and set it aside, his movement steady, almost unbothered. "I'm just here to work, Mr. Merrick," Darnell said quietly, his voice carrying a surprising steadiness that seemed to cut through the snickers. He didn't stutter, didn't bow his head. He simply spoke with a quiet dignity that made some of the younger fighters shift uneasily in their seats. Victor chuckled, his smirk widening. He fed off the energy of the crowd, and he knew they were watching, waiting to see how far he would push this. Work? Come on, man. You're in a gym. You got a ring right there. Let's see what you got. I bet you wouldn't last 30 seconds with me. This time the laughter was louder, less nervous, more like a wave sweeping across the gym. Some clapped their hands. Others shook their heads, already expecting Darnell to refuse. The janitor? In the cage? The idea seemed ridiculous, even insulting to the sport. Darnell stood with his hands loose at his sides, his chest rising and falling slowly, his expression unreadable. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't shrinking either. Victor stepped closer, pointing at the cage like he was calling him to the stage. What do you say, Hughes? 1 round. No pressure, just 30 seconds with me. I'll even go easy on you. His grin turned sharp and his eyes glittered with the thrill of what he thought was an easy humiliation. The fighters waited. Some leaned forward, eager to watch the spectacle. Others looked away, uncomfortable but unwilling to speak against Victor. The room's energy grew heavy, the kind of silence that pressed down on every chest while anticipation stretched the moment longer. Darnell finally shifted, slowly lowering the mop handle he had been holding, and then he lifted his head fully to meet Victor's eyes. His stare was steady, unshaken, carrying a weight that few noticed but none could deny. In that moment, something shifted. The crowd didn't laugh anymore. The gym, so often alive with noise and bravado, suddenly felt suspended in silence. It was the kind of silence that comes just before a storm, heavy with expectation, as everyone realized this was no longer just a joke. This was about respect. The hidden past for most people in the gym. Darnell Hughes was invisible, a shadow that drifted quietly between the heavy bags and the locker rooms with a mop and bucket in hand. They knew nothing of him beyond the creak of the mop handle, the squeak of wet rubber shoes on the floor, and the soft rustle of trash bags as he worked in the background. To them, he was simply the janitor, a man who swept up after their sweat and blood, someone who existed only in the periphery of their ambition. But what none of them realized, not even Victor Merrick with all his arrogance, was that Darnell carried a story heavier than the weight plates stacked against the gym wall. Behind the quiet eyes and steady hands was a life shaped by struggle, discipline, and a kind of toughness that could not be measured in push-ups or sparring rounds. Darnell had grown up far from the polished streets of Phoenix. His childhood had unfolded in Oakland, California, during a time when the city was hard on anyone without money or protection. His mother worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3, and still came home exhausted, her hands swollen from cleaning offices during the day and waiting tables at night. His father had been gone before Darnell could even remember his face, leaving behind only questions and the occasional bitter silence in his mother's voice when neighbors asked about him. That absence meant that from a young age, Darnell became both brother and protector to his younger sibling, Marcus. Every day felt like a fight for survival, and survival demanded not only food and shelter, but also the ability to defend oneself from the dangers that prowled the streets. It was in those streets that Darnell first learned the rhythm of combat. He discovered a small community boxing gym tucked between run-down buildings, a place that smelled of old sweat and determination. The gym was run by Coach Ramirez, an old fighter whose career had ended with too many scars and too few trophies, but whose heart was big enough to keep kids like Darnell off the corners. The coach only charged a couple of dollars a week. Sometimes he didn't charge at all, and in exchange he offered gloves, a ring, and the kind of lessons no school ever taught. Discipline first, Ramirez used to say, tapping his own chest with a crooked finger. You learn discipline in here, you survive out there. Darnell soaked up those lessons like dry ground in a storm. He was quick, his hands fast, his instincts sharper than most boys his age. At first, boxing was just a way to protect himself, but soon it became something deeper, a rhythm he carried in his bones. Each jab, each slip, each pivot on the worn canvas taught him more than just fighting. It taught him control, patience, and the quiet confidence that comes when you know you can defend yourself if you must. By his teenage years, he entered small amateur matches, the kind where the prize money barely covered groceries but where victory meant more than cash. It meant dignity. He never dreamed of titles or belts, because life had already shown him that dreams often drowned under the weight of bills and responsibility. He fought because fighting gave him a place where his struggles made sense. But life has a way of demanding sacrifices. His mother's health began to fail in his late teens, the years of exhaustion finally catching up to her. Hospital visits drained what little savings they had, and suddenly, every hour Darnell spent in the gym felt like an hour stolen from the chance to provide for his family. With Marcus still in school, it fell on Darnell to carry the burden. He took jobs wherever he could find them. Construction sites, warehouses, janitorial shifts, anything steady, anything that could put food on the table. The gloves that once wrapped his hands were replaced with calluses from lifting crates and mopping floors. The sound of the bell that once signaled rounds in the ring was replaced with the alarm clock that dragged him from bed before sunrise for another long day of labor. His life shifted from fighting opponents to fighting circumstances, and the world quickly forgot that Darnell had ever been more than just another working man. By the time he reached his 30s, he had drifted into Phoenix, taking work wherever it appeared. Iron Pride Gym had been just another paycheck at first, one more stop in a long line of jobs. He didn't mind the cleaning. In some ways, it gave him peace. The rhythm of the mop strokes mirrored the rhythm of the jabs he used to throw, a quiet echo of the boy who had once dreamed of becoming something more. The fighters hardly noticed him, and he preferred it that way. He had learned that invisibility could be a shield. When no one noticed you, no one bothered you. When no one asked questions, no one could remind you of what you once had and what you gave up. Yet invisibility carried its own weight. People assumed silence meant weakness. They assumed that a man cleaning floors had no stories worth hearing, no strength worth respecting. They saw only the mop, not the fist that once danced in a ring. They saw only the janitor, not the survivor who had weathered storms harsher than any sparring session. And for Victor Merrick, a man who thrived on dominance, Darnell's quiet resistance to humiliation was more than an annoyance. It was a challenge to his authority. As Darnell stood in the gym that day, trash bag tied neatly at his side, he could feel the weight of 100 eyes pressing down on him. He wasn't just a janitor anymore. Victor had dragged him into the center of attention, and in that spotlight the ghosts of his past rose up like a tide. He remembered the sting of sweat in his eyes under dim boxing lights. He remembered the roar of small crowds when his hand was raised in victory. He remembered the lessons of Coach Ramirez, the words that had carried him through dark nights. Discipline first. And beneath it all, he remembered the long years of silence, of being overlooked, underestimated, dismissed. For a long moment, he considered staying silent as he always had. It would have been easy to shake his head, to walk away, to let Victor have his laugh and the crowd its entertainment. But something in him stirred, something that had slept too long. This wasn't about fighting for money or for glory or even for revenge. It was about dignity. It was about reminding everyone in that room, including himself, that respect is not tied to a paycheck or a title. It was about showing that even a man with a mop in his hands could carry strength in his heart. The gym held its breath as Darnell finally spoke. His voice calm but steady, carrying a weight that silenced the smirks around him. "If you want me in that ring, Mr. Merrick," he said, "then I'll step in. But not for laughs and not for 30 seconds. I'll step in because respect isn't something you give, it's something you earn." The words struck the room like a sudden thunderclap. Fighters glanced at one another in disbelief, some with wide eyes, others with the kind of awe that only comes when you realize you've been misjudging a man for far too long. Victor's grin faltered for a heartbeat, but only for a heartbeat. Then it returned, sharper than before, feeding off the energy of the crowd. To him, this was still a joke, still an easy lesson to prove his dominance. To Darnell, it was something entirely different. In that moment, the stage was set. The janitor was no longer just a shadow in the gym. He was a man about to step into the light, carrying with him the weight of a hidden past that no one had cared to see until now. Into the ring, the cage at Iron Pride Gym had always been a place of sweat, pain, and spectacle. Fighters stepped into it with their hearts pounding, some with fear disguised as bravado, others with confidence sharpened through endless hours of training. But never before had the cage been the stage for what was about to happen that day. As the janitor's words echoed through the gym, steady, calm, and filled with a weight that silenced laughter, the energy in the room shifted in a way that no one could quite explain. People had come to expect Victor Merrick's arrogance, his sharp tongue, his dominance over everyone who dared to question him. But no one expected the janitor to answer back. And not only answer back, but accept. The janitor, the man with the mop, had agreed to step into the cage with the trainer himself. The ripple of disbelief spread across the fighters and bystanders like a wave. Some whispered in hushed tones, exchanging glances that mixed shock with curiosity. A few of the younger ones smirked, thinking this would be a quick and humiliating display. Others felt a knot forming in their stomachs, as if they had just witnessed something that carried more gravity than they could explain. Whatever side they leaned toward, no one left. Every eye stayed fixed on the unfolding scene, every heartbeat sinking with the tension that now weighed down the air like a heavy storm cloud. Victor thrived in this spotlight. He fed off the nervous energy, the anticipation, the whispers that carried his name around the room like a chant. He leaned against the cage with casual arrogance, his broad arms crossed, his grin flashing with cruel confidence. To him, this was entertainment. He would give his fighters a show, prove once again that toughness belonged only to those willing to be broken and rebuilt by his methods. He would humble the janitor, force him to stumble, sweat, and retreat in front of a crowd, and in doing so, cement his own authority beyond question. "Come on then, Hughes," Victor called out, his voice booming like a challenge hurled from a throne. "Step into my house. Let's see if that mop taught you how to throw a punch." Darnell didn't rush. He didn't move with the nervousness of someone who felt trapped in a dare. Instead, he placed his mop neatly against the wall, rolled his shoulders once, and walked toward the cage with a steady, measured stride. There was no bravado in his steps, no theatrics, no attempt to stir the crowd. He moved like a man who had already made peace with his choice, like someone whose dignity would remain intact whether he won, lost, or simply endured. That calmness unsettled some of the fighters more than anger would have. They expected resistance, maybe excuses, perhaps even fear. What they saw instead was composure, and composure often hides things the untrained eye cannot see. As Darnell reached the cage, he paused, not because of hesitation, but because ritual demanded it. He looked at the steel door, at the ropes inside, at the sweat-stained canvas floor where countless battles had played out. He exhaled deeply, not nervously but almost reverently, as though the cage was not just a ring but a crucible. Then with deliberate steps he entered, the clang of the door behind him echoing like the toll of a bell. The gym went quiet. Even the whirring fans seemed to fade, leaving only the sound of Victor cracking his knuckles and pacing with the swagger of a man preparing to put on a performance. Darnell stood across from him, hands loose at his sides, shoulders relaxed, his expression calm but focused. He didn't raise his fists immediately. He didn't posture or pretend. He simply stood watching, his gaze steady, unflinching. That gaze made a few of the onlookers shift uncomfortably, though they couldn't explain why. There was something in those eyes, something that whispered of storms weathered and battles fought long before this moment. Victor, of course, mistook that calmness for hesitation. He laughed, shaking his head as he turned to the crowd. "You all see this? Man looks like he's about to fold before I even touch him. Don't blink or this will be over before it starts." The crowd chuckled along, though their laughter was thinner now, hesitant, stretched tight against the silence of the janitor. The trainer stepped forward, raising his fists, bouncing lightly on the balls of his feet as if to remind everyone of his athleticism, his training, his skill. He jabbed the air once, twice, sharp and loud, the sound of his gloves slicing through the heavy air. Then he tilted his chin up, smirking at Darnell. "Come on, Hughes. Show us you can do more than scrub floors." Darnell finally moved. He lifted his hands, not hurriedly, not with the awkwardness of someone untrained, but with the smooth rhythm of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. His stance wasn't flashy. It wasn't exaggerated. It was balanced, natural, the kind of stance that comes from muscle memory burned into the body over years of practice. His shoulders settled into the posture of a fighter, his chin lowered, his eyes locked onto Victor with a steady focus that made even the most skeptical observers pause. For the first time, a few whispers of doubt crept into the crowd. Victor didn't notice. He was too busy preparing his performance. He raised his gloves higher, grinning like a showman before a cheap act. He had already written the story in his mind. He would dance around, maybe land a few light shots, watch the janitor flinch, and then finish it quickly with a push or a harmless takedown. He imagined the laughter, the cheers, the reinforcement of his dominance. What he didn't realize was that the story he had written in his head was about to be rewritten entirely. The referee wasn't needed for this impromptu match. Victor himself would control the pace. He circled once, testing the distance, throwing a feint jab to see if Darnell would flinch. Darnell didn't move, didn't blink, didn't break eye contact. He simply adjusted his weight, a subtle shift that only trained eyes would recognize as readiness. The crowd leaned forward, breaths held, waiting for the first strike. And then it happened. Victor lunged in with a sharp jab, quick and confident, his lips curled into a mocking grin. He expected Darnell to retreat, to stumble, to look like a man far out of his depth. Instead, Darnell slipped the jab with a fluid motion, his body angling just enough to let the punch pass harmlessly by. The movement was so natural, so smooth, that for a moment, the crowd didn't even register what they had seen. But Victor did. His grin faltered just for a split second, replaced by surprise. Before he could recover, before he could reset his stance, Darnell's fist moved with the speed and precision of a coiled spring finally released. It wasn't wild, it wasn't desperate, it was controlled, measured, and devastatingly accurate. The punch connected squarely with Victor's jaw, the sound sharp enough to slice through the silence of the gym. Time seemed to pause as the trainer's head snapped to the side, his body staggering backward, his balance betraying him. The smirk that had carried him through countless taunts was wiped clean from his face as his legs buckled beneath him. The crowd gasped as one, a collective intake of breath that filled the entire gym with stunned silence. And then, with the inevitability of a falling tree, Victor collapsed onto the canvas, his body hitting the floor with a thud that echoed like thunder. The man who had mocked, taunted, and strutted with arrogance now lay flat on his back, staring up at the fluorescent lights, his mouth slightly open in disbelief. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The room was frozen, suspended between the impossible and the undeniable. And in that frozen silence, the janitor, quiet, humble, overlooked Darnell Hughes, stood tall, his hands lowered once again, his expression unchanged. He had not roared in triumph. He had not raised his arms in victory. He simply stood as if the outcome had been inevitable, as if the punch had been nothing more than an extension of the truth he had carried inside him all along. The silence of the gym was heavier than any noise could have been. It was the silence of shock, of realization, of respect forced into existence by the undeniable. Every fighter, every spectator, even those who had laughed moments before, now stared at the man they had dismissed, their own thoughts colliding with the reality of what they had just witnessed. In that moment, Iron Pride Gym was no longer Victor Merrick's kingdom. The crown had been shattered with a single punch, and the lesson of respect had begun to take shape. The silence after impact, for a long moment after Victor Merrick hit the canvas, the gym was held in a grip of silence so complete that even the hum of the fluorescent light seemed louder. The sound of his fall still echoed in the minds of everyone present, like thunder reverberating after a sudden storm. The fighters who had been leaning forward, ready to laugh, now sat frozen with their mouths half open, as if their brains had not yet caught up with what their eyes had just seen. Others who had been uneasy from the start felt their hearts racing, because they knew instinctively that something far bigger than a single punch had just taken place. The atmosphere was no longer one of entertainment or mockery. It had shifted into something heavy, undeniable and unforgettable. Victor lay sprawled on the mat, his chest rising and falling quickly as he blinked up at the ceiling in a haze of disbelief. His pride had always been as unshakable as his body, but in that moment both had been broken in front of the very audience that usually bowed to his dominance. He tried to push himself up, his muscles straining with the effort, but the wobble in his arms betrayed the weakness that one precise strike had exposed. He shook his head as if to clear it, yet the dazed look in his eyes told the truth. The man who claimed to be unbreakable had been broken in an instant. The crowd shifted uneasily, the weight of silence pressing down on them. These were men and women who trained day after day to earn respect through sweat, bruises, and relentless repetition. And yet they had just witnessed respect earned in a single moment of absolute clarity. Their gazes turned toward Darnell, the man who stood across the cage with his arms lowered, not triumphant, not gloating but steady, calm and unshaken. There was no arrogance in his posture, no celebration in his eyes. He did not need to raise his fist to proclaim victory, because victory radiated from the very way he stood, quietly powerful, composed and dignified. Whispers began to ripple across the gym, hesitant at first, then louder as disbelief gave way to realization. "Did you see that slip?" someone murmured. "That punch, man, that wasn't luck," another voice added. A young fighter leaned toward his friend, eyes wide, and whispered, "He moved like he's done this before." Slowly, Recognition began to dawn on those present. The janitor was not just a man with a mop, not just a worker paid to clean the sweat of others. He was something else entirely. Someone who carried training, discipline, and strength hidden beneath the plain clothes and quiet demeanor. For Victor, the silence was torture. All his life in the gym had been built around control, dominance, and the fear he instilled in others. He had built his authority like a fortress, stone by stone, word by word, shout by shout. But now, lying flat on the mat, he felt the walls of that fortress crumble with every second of silence that passed. He pushed himself onto his elbows, his jaw aching, his pride burning hotter than any bruise, and he glared across at Darnell. Yet even in his glare there was a flicker of something new, something Victor was not used to feeling. It was not hatred, not even anger. It was respect forced into existence by truth. Darnell remained unmoved, his eyes steady, his breathing even. He had not come to humiliate, and that was clear in the way he carried himself. He had stepped into the ring not for victory, but for dignity, and the difference between those two was written across every inch of his posture. He stood as a man who knew his own strength but did not need to shout it. In that stillness, the lesson was louder than any words could have been. True power does not need to announce itself. It simply reveals itself when the moment demands. The fighters around the cage began to shift from shock to admiration. Some lowered their heads in quiet respect, embarrassed that they had ever laughed at him. Others stared at Darnell with a new kind of awe, as if seeing him for the first time. Even the youngest and most arrogant of the trainees, the ones who had cheered at Victor's mockery earlier, now sat silently, the weight of their mistake settling heavily on their shoulders. The janitor they had overlooked had just taught them a lesson more valuable than anything Victor had ever barked at them. Never judge a man by the job he holds, the clothes he wears, or the silence he keeps. A trainer from the far corner of the gym, an older man who had been leaning against the wall, finally spoke into the hush. His voice carried the authority of years and the clarity of truth. "That wasn't luck," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "That was skill. That was experience. And it was respect." His words cut through the fog of disbelief, anchoring the moment in reality. Heads nodded slowly, the truth sinking deeper into every heart present. Victor managed to sit up fully, his hand rubbing his jaw, his pride bruised more deeply than his body. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. For the first time in years, he had nothing to say. No insult, no lecture, no command. His voice, once the loudest in the gym, had been stolen by the silence of respect. The crowd didn't need him to explain what had happened. They had seen it with their own eyes, felt it in their own chests. Darnell finally broke the silence, his voice low but firm, every word measured like the rhythm of a steady heartbeat. Respect isn't given because you shout the loudest. It's earned when you carry yourself with discipline. That's all. He didn't raise his voice, didn't seek applause, but the words struck deeper than any punch could. They lingered in the air, heavy with truth, reshaping the atmosphere of Iron Pride Gym. The silence after impact had become something sacred. It was no longer the silence of disbelief, but the silence of transformation. The moment when pride, arrogance, and cruelty had been shattered and replaced with humility, respect, and a new understanding. The fighters in that gym would remember that day for the rest of their lives, not because the trainer had been knocked down, but because the janitor had stood tall. The lesson of respect is. The silence lingered in the gym. The atmosphere felt almost unreal. The fighters and spectators who had gathered expecting laughter and humiliation now found themselves standing in the middle of a life lesson so sharp, so undeniable, that it cut through all pretense. It wasn't just that Victor Merrick had been knocked down. It was that every single person in that room had been forced to reconsider everything they thought they knew about strength, respect, and dignity. The moment had cracked open something far larger than one trainer's pride. It had exposed the truth that had been hiding in plain sight all along. Victor remained seated on the mat for what felt like an eternity, his jaw aching, his ego shattered, his eyes flickering with emotions he had not felt in years. For so long he had defined toughness as the ability to bark louder, to push harder, to break others down in order to build them back up. His authority had been rooted in fear, and he had mistaken silence for weakness. But as he looked across the cage at Darnell Hughes, standing steady and calm with no gloating in his eyes, Victor felt something he had not expected: humility. In that moment, he realized that the janitor had taught him more with a single punch and a steady gaze than he had taught his fighters in years of shouting and posturing. Slowly, painfully, Victor pushed himself to his feet. The crowd held its breath, waiting for his reaction. Would he explode in anger? Demand a rematch, try to reclaim his pride with violence or words? Or would he acknowledge the truth everyone had already seen? He stood there swaying for a moment, his broad chest rising and falling, his fists clenched not in preparation for another strike, but in the struggle to swallow his pride. Finally, he stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and the janitor. The gym fell silent again, anticipation heavy as the air. And then, in a gesture that stunned the room even further, Victor extended his hand. His voice, usually sharp and booming, came out low and rough, but with a sincerity no one had heard from him before. "You've earned my respect, Hughes," he said. "More than most men ever have." The words broke the tension like sunlight cutting through storm clouds. Gasps and murmurs spread across the gym, but this time they were not born of disbelief. They were born of relief, of admiration, of recognition that something rare and profound had just taken place. Darnell looked at the hand for a long moment, his face steady as always. Then he reached out and clasped it firmly. He did not smile, did not boast, did not raise his voice. He simply nodded once, a gesture of acceptance that carried more weight than any celebration could. Around the cage, the fighters who had laughed earlier now shifted with a new awareness. They saw the truth written plainly before them. Respect was not about titles or positions, not about who shouted the loudest or strutted the most confidently. Respect came from character, from discipline, from humility carried with quiet strength. In that handshake between Victor and Darnell, the gym itself seemed to transform. It was no longer just a place where bodies were tested and egos flexed. It had become, in that instant, a place where dignity had spoken louder than pride. From that day forward, the atmosphere inside Iron Pride Gym was never the same. The fighters who once dismissed the janitor now greeted him with nods of respect, their eyes reflecting a new understanding. They no longer saw just a man with a mop. They saw a man who had stood tall when it mattered, who had revealed strength without arrogance and dignity without demand. For many of them, the memory of that moment became a compass, guiding them not only in the cage but in life itself. Whenever they were tempted to underestimate someone, they remembered the silence after impact. Whenever they felt the urge to judge by appearances, they recalled the calm stare of Darnell Hughes. Even Victor changed. He did not become soft, nor did he lose his edge as a trainer, but the arrogance that had once defined him began to fade. He pushed his fighters hard, but now his voice carried something new, an undercurrent of respect. He learned to listen as much as he barked, to teach through example as much as command. And when newcomers to the gym asked about the man who mopped the floors, Victor himself would sometimes tell the story, his voice carrying the honesty of someone who had been humbled. "Don't ever mistake silence for weakness," he would say. "I did once. It cost me my pride in front of all of you. That man taught me what respect really means." As for Darnell, he returned to his work as if nothing had changed. The very next morning, he picked up his mop and bucket, cleaned the mirrors, emptied the trash, and swept the floors with the same steady rhythm. He did not seek glory, did not demand recognition, and did not act any differently than before. But the way people looked at him had changed forever. And though he never sought the spotlight, he had become a quiet legend within those walls. Not because of one punch, but because of the lesson behind it. The story of that day spread beyond the gym. Fighters told it to their friends, who told it to others, until it became something larger than just a gym story. It became a parable about humility, strength, and dignity. It became a reminder that the greatest power often hides in the places we overlook, and that respect once truly earned cannot be denied, and so, the lesson remained etched in the minds of all who witnessed it. True strength is not about how loudly you shout or how hard you strike, but about the quiet confidence to stand with dignity when the world underestimates you. True respect cannot be forced or demanded. It must be earned, often in the most unexpected ways. That day inside Iron Pride Gym, when the trainer fell and the janitor stood tall, was not just about a fight. It was about humanity, about the invisible battles people carry within them, and about the truth that appearances deceive while character reveals. Long after the mats were cleaned and the echoes of that thunderous punch faded, the lesson remained: never judge too quickly, Never mock what you do not understand. And never forget that respect belongs to those who walk in discipline and strength, no matter what role the world assigns them.